The people can relax, knowing that enough has been brought home to secure them against winter, to start the cycle again in the coming year. The boats are in, safe from the coming storms. Everything draws closer and closer to the home. The air is crisp. The sun is low in the sky these days. On Inishmore and the Aran Islands, Dara Joyce is burying potatoes in the small field in front of his house. The potato is the second last crop to be harvested. Once safely out of the ground, they have to be stored for winter, and the traditional if surprising method is to bury them in the ground again, in pits lined with straw. The potatoes are poured from their sacks into the straw-lined pit, back into the earth they grew from. Covered again with straw and earth, they will be safe against frost and weather for the coming winter. These ritual tasks signal a slowing down of activity. Now panic and uncertainty are over, and it is time to conserve and preserve what has been won, to lay down what will be slowly brought out again during the slow, cold months ahead. It's like a riddle. We dig them up, we bury them again, they keep us alive in winter. In many places, the potato pit is still regarded as the best way to store potatoes. What work there is gathers in around the house and home. For most of the year, this is the women's domain, the place where they have charge of food and frugal comfort and simple clothing for the entire family. Now the men are about the place more, but they still have separate preoccupations. They have time to look about them, to think of the furniture needed for the home, of the farm implements they must make or repair from the few natural resources available to them. The farmyard and the house are the domain of the women. This is where they care for their families, take care of dairying, of the hens, the pig rearing. This is also where spinning and the making of clothes happens. These women make their own and their children's clothes. They are the spinners and users of fibre, of flax and wool. While the women occupy themselves with these tasks, the men are often engaged in wicker work. All manner of useful things are made of wicker, using local materials and employing skills passed down from father to son. Here on the Aran Islands, as elsewhere, old superstitions pass from generation to generation, and the starkest of these beliefs and customs are found at Halloween, the eve of Samhain, the 1st of November, when the living come closely into contact with the dead. An old calendar of pagan custom still lives beneath the surface of daily life, and it comes most vividly into view on this day and night. When the other world enters ours, the traditional instinct is to meet in elaborate disguise. These masks of mischief are a response to the puka and other spirits who walk abroad on earth for the duration of this night. The great external dramas of sowing and harvesting, the anxious eye on the weather, are stilled. The instinct is to create a more intimate human drama, to reach into memory and the psyche for thrilling shapes and masks. The children too go about in masks, early initiates into the tradition it will one day be their duty to maintain. With the help of the women, they go from house to house, collecting treats for the coming evening's party. children, masks and the dark is of course a recipe for pure mischief. Keeping the religious and traditional customs alive for a new generation was always the responsibility of the women. These winter festivals are a defiance of winter. The masked dancers are indulging in energetic joy in being alive. So close are the ties with emigrants here that the latest masks from the USA, or indeed South Africa, are often found in Inishmore before they are found anywhere else in Ireland. In the light of day, in the slow time of oncoming winter, those with the skills passed down from older generations had the time to practice them. Bill Egan from Clonfanlock in Offaly is a wicker worker, a shy bachelor farmer, a man respected by his neighbours. The folklore collector Jim Delaney heard about Bill and got to know him by asking him to make him a crandy, a potato basket. Here Bill is making a sheep crib, a feeder that kept hay off the ground through the wet days. The material he is using is the versatile hazel rod. The method he is following is ageless. Bill Egan was commissioned by the National Museum to make his version of the sheep crib in 1969. By then, the sheep crib, like so many other wickerwork items, was fast becoming a thing of the past. In museum collections, north and south, there is an extensive range of wickerwork. The materials were plentiful: sallies, osiers and hazel for baskets of all sorts and descriptions. Bill made many items for the museum, among them the universal bird trap, cleverly constructed from the willow rod and elderwood. Bill Egan's work is stored away here against time, the work of a man Jim Delaney described as one of the finest men I have ever met, honourable, upright and generous to a fault. Bill Egan's holding of land was no more than a few acres, and he would hire himself out to other farmers in the locality to supplement his income. Though their holdings were larger than his, these men also were no more than small farmers. Clonfanlock in Offaly is an area of mixed farming interspersed with turf bogs. Bill's trade was well-making. He could source water and sink the well, but he had another string to his bow also. Many farms around here keep sheep in some numbers. They are relatively cheap to feed and provide a welcome cash income to the farmer. But they are pernickety eaters. They won't eat hay they have trampled into the ground, and Bill Egan's sheep cribs are the solution. "8 feet tall, 4 feet in diameter, the sheep crib was woven of tightly interlaced hazel rods, tapped down tight with a wooden mallet. Bill Egan caps his crib with a cover of sacking to keep the rain off. He then places another layer of sacking directly under the hay to keep the feed dry and convenient for the sheep. Bill's sheep cribs were so tightly constructed, even a flock of hungry animals couldn't damage them. Here at the dark end of the year, Bill, like so many other men, is still drawn to working out of doors, while the women keep close to the fire and shelter in their round of tasks. In some ways, it's curious that basket making was such a male preserve. Perhaps it was because, at the finishing stage, manual dexterity and strength were required, the kind of strength more likely to be developed in the year's work out in the fields. Today, many of the fine work basket makers are women. Largely self-taught, Alison Fitzgerald is one of a new breed of wicker worker. She started making baskets as a hobby some 17 years ago when she moved from her native England to live in Armagh. Alison's baskets are made to a very high standard. The rods she uses are of different colours: green, red, brown and the aromatic black. She grows some of these rods herself. Others she has to buy in to supply her workshops. In October, when the trees are nearly bare and the fields are fallow, the skeleton of the world becomes visible. This is when rods are cut, from hedgerows of course, but also from purpose-planted sally gardens. Johnny Hannon from Clogher, Monasterraden, County Sligo, is a skilled and accomplished basket maker. He cuts his sallies from a garden he maintains near his home.
Sally rods that I have, they were there before my time. I planted some of them myself, all right, but you have to cut them back every year. If you don't cut them, they'll go wild. Because the branches are growing and they're no good yet. You have to cut them back every year. And you get a crop, you get rods maybe up to 12 feet long, growing in one season.
The Sally Garden was not just a picturesque location for a Yeats poem. Sallies were tended and cultivated like any other crop for practical reasons.
You can cut them anytime from the end of September up until the 1st of March if you want. But they're best cut around October. And then you have to let them season for about 3-4 months.
Everywhere you turned in Ireland in those days, there were baskets. There was an enormous range of these wicker containers. They came in all shapes and sizes for carrying large loads on the back. They carried fleece for carding, furs for cattle feed, and vegetables for the market.
They use the basket for the creel, as we'll call it, for picking potatoes, turf, manure, everything. Whenever they needed rod, they went out and cut the rods and made it.
The creels and panniers made for transport by horse and donkey most often carried turf and manure. Seaweed, either as valuable kelp or as manure for the potato crop, was carried from the shore by people and animals in a variety of baskets. Here in the Clogher Community Hall in Monasterraden, Johnny Hannon demonstrates the making of a creel from green sally rods. The wooden frame he's using to hold the uprights of the baskets came from his father before him and meant the work could be brought indoors to the warmth of the fire in winter.
And I saw my father making them when I was only a child. I just picked it up how to make them. It's nearly a thing in the past with the youngsters. The youngsters don't know how to make them. And they're not interested in learning how to make them. Whereas years ago, everybody could make creels. All the old men could make them.
As with all traditional crafts, the making of wickerwork has its trade secrets. Michael Salmon from Cross near Lewisburg, County Mayo, is soaking his rods in the small lake in front of his house. They had become a little too seasoned for proper working and are now pliable enough for his needs. As late as the 1970s, Michael was still making baskets for his own use around the farm. The National Museum cameraman Brendan Doyle recorded him making a pannier or pardog. He begins by cutting a scraw or rectangular sod from a nearby field. On this he places his wooden template before pushing in the long uprights which will give him the frame. With the uprights secured, the template is removed and the intricate weaving can begin. This pardog has a detachable base. It is specially adapted in this area for carrying loads of manure on the side of the donkey. The pardogs, of course, need to be balanced evenly and their loads released at the same time, otherwise the donkey keels over. Traditional basket makers used the rods just as they had been harvested. All the materials used around the house and farmyard, from the skibs used to strain potatoes to the creel Johnny is making, the panniers or pardogs used to haul turf and manure, were made from unpeeled rods. So were the traps and pots used by fishermen along coastal and river stretches to catch lobster and crab and eel. The basket was the only container available to farmers for a long time. The same basket was used to fetch the seaweed for manuring potatoes, for setting the seed potatoes, and for gathering in the eventual crop. So widespread was the use of baskets, so varied were the kinds found all over the country, that the museums have a huge variety of these pots and baskets, cribs and creels, skibs and pardogs. Like this heather lobster pot, such work is testament to ingenuity, inherited skill, a willingness to make use of the simplest materials to speed the work or to lighten the burden. Michael O'Malley of Inishturk, County Mayo, weaves heather stems from the hillside to make this lobster pot. Nicholas Hilliard from near Tinahely, County Wicklow, is splitting oak laths, which he will combine with the usual sallies to make a strong basket. The same kind of work was done on a large scale in this yard on Lough Neagh, belonging to the Mulholland basket-making family. These oak strips are needed to give strength to potato baskets, which will have to put up with being dragged over rough ground. The weave of the basket will be made up with sallies, and the rim will be bent into shape from a wand of hazel. Nicholas Hilliard was filmed by the National Museum in 1950 making this basket. He uses techniques which are part of his family inheritance. His father Thomas, his 4 brothers, his grandfather and his great-grandfather were also basket makers. Brendan Hannon comes from a line of basket makers associated with the Mulholland basket-making industry, which was established along the shores of Lough Neagh at the beginning of this century. The business flourished between the 2 world wars, giving constant employment to 30 workers. Even though the industry as such has decayed, basket making is still a strong tradition in the area. Brendan has adapted the local designs to produce very fine whiteware for use as laundry and decorative baskets around the home. He also takes orders for a variety of other fine basketry, including shopping baskets, bicycle baskets, and the fisherman's creel. In the past, these baskets had to be tough and durable to withstand the treatment handed out to them in the muddy fields and the heavy loads they had to carry. Peter Byrne came from the townland of Treil in the parish of Leggan, County Longford. Peter's specialty was this particular boat-shaped skib or potato teaming basket. For a framework, he used the thick stem of the wild rose, and he worked to ensure the skib came out as flat as possible. This was the potato basket used in County Longford. It was used every day for straining the big pot of potatoes for both human and animal consumption. Here on the Aran Islands, as on the other islands, the inclement weather, especially the battering winds, make the growing of trees next to impossible. Sallies, however, can be grown, and there is a tradition of basket making here. A round and rimmed version of the potato teeming basket is known here as the Kishogue. Here on Arran, Dublin-born Vincent McKernan is a newly initiated basket maker.
Well, I came out here for an Easter weekend. I'm here 22 years. Joe Hogan came out and did a course with us, and there was a group of 24 started. I was the only one that really kept it up, hopefully with the intention of keeping going. This is the first year I really got into it seriously to make baskets. Up until that, I've been more as experimenting and trying to get the hang of the different techniques. I've been working on Sally gardens here now, trying to clean them out because they've been idle over the last few years, and hopefully get them to a stage that I'll be able to supply myself here on the island. Up until now, I more or less have to get the stuff in from the mainland. Most families had a garden of willow, so they make their own Kishogue and their own creels. There are a lot of people who can make them, and especially the old folk. My father-in-law, for one now, is a great creel maker and a great Kishogue maker. But I'd hope to see, like in the next 4 or 5 years, that I could sustain what I'd need myself, that I'd be able to grow it here on the island.
Vincent is optimistic that a craft and trade which once flourished on the island can be revived. Back in the 1970s, the Shanahan brothers of Carrick-on-Suir, County Tipperary, believed that the slow demise of their trade was unstoppable. The Shanahans had about 30 acres of land along the River Suir at Fidown, from where they drew their supplies of willow. The family business had survived for 3 generations, almost 90 years from the time in the 1880s when John Shanahan set up the business. His sons, nephews and grandsons all worked as basket makers, and his 2 grandsons, Michael and Joe, were the last in the line. The Shanahans in their earlier days made hampers for British Rail used in transporting fowl, and they supplied yeast baskets to the bakers of the southeast. Michael and Joe, the grandsons, diversified into fine wicker furniture, which in time became the main product of their Willowcraft business. The traditional skills which had been kept alive across the country by winter firesides were here allied to innovative business thinking. The business, though, was already flagging when the Second World War and its shortages of materials gave the Shanahans' business a boost. They had constant contact with the local fishermen. Kilmore Quay fishermen got their willow rods for making lobster pots from the Shanahans. The eel fishermen ordered their wicker eel traps from them, and the herring fishermen put in their orders for the herring cran. The government specified the dimensions of the cran, as it was an official measure for fish landed at ports throughout the country. The basket Joe Shanahan is making here, under the watchful eye of his sister, is a quarter cran. 4 of these would hold 37.5 gallons of fish. The Shanahans were recognised as master craftsmen. The baskets and furniture they produced were well made and much sought after. Joe, the last Shanahan basket maker, was invited to Bloomingdale's in New York to demonstrate his craft in 1981. In his latter days, he trained in several young local people in the craft he and his family had followed with such pride. Joe's motto was, anyone can make a basket, but if you want to make a living at it, you have to work fast. Johnny Hannon's year marks a perfect round. Each winter he cuts down his sallies to make baskets. Cutting the sallies promotes new growth so that when the following winter comes around, he has a fresh supply of sallies to make a new supply of baskets. The tools used were few and straightforward. A hook, or more recently a secateurs, to cut the rods, a wooden mallet to hammer the weave tightly into position, a sharp knife to point the rods and to trim the weave. It is true that some women made baskets from necessity. On the whole, however, it was men who followed the trade, passing on regional designs from one generation to the next.
Well, I think they're more antiques now, or ornaments. There's nobody carrying possessions on them anymore.
All year round, the home was the domain of the women. These pots, kettles and quernstones, this crib or cradle, are mute testimony to the lives they led. It was in the house and in the yard that women found their defining roles. They reared the children, they raised and tended hens and pigs, they looked after the dairying. During spring and harvest time, the women worked their share in the fields and in the bogs, helping to secure the family's food and fuel. During the winter months, while the men worked with sally and hazel rods, the women fashioned with fibres. They made all their own and their children's clothes, either from sheep fleece or from the linen thread won and woven from the strong fibres of flax. Before this kind of work was removed to the factories, most of the spinning and reeling of the linen and woolen thread was done by women in the smoky comfort of their homes. They started young at the work. Nobody knows for certain where the spinning wheel was invented, but it had probably already arrived in Ireland by the 14th century. The most common wheel was known as the long Irish wheel. Used until recently in Kerry, where the spinner sat in comfort, the wheel was also found in Mayo and Galway, where the spinner stood, presumably to give more control over the spinning.
There are so many lipsticks designed to be lasting or caring, but to find one that does both, who would you listen to? Me, magazines, a friend? In a recent independent survey, 4 out of 5 women who tried an Oil of Ulay lipstick said they'd recommend it to a friend. And tests prove it does care. And it does last. And the name, Oil of Ulay's Colour Moist Lipstick, as recommended by 4 out of 5 women. We can prove long-lasting colour can care.
I don't wanna lose you.
No two people ever fell in love and felt exactly the same way. That's why none of the best recent love songs sound the same. From In Excess, Tina Turner, Elton John, and Crowded House, to Lighthouse Family, Everything But the Girl, East 17, and Gabrielle.
No more pain and no sorrow. That's what I need from her. Is forever love.
They're all on Modern Love. 60 original tracks on 4 CDs or cassettes. Nearly 4 hours worth.
Is this burning an eternal flame?
But you can't buy Modern Love in the shops. You have to order by phone. To get your copy, call now. Insight at Polygram. We know great music when we hear it.
Here in Achill there was a strong tradition of spinning. At her home in Corran, Annie Corrigan gives a demonstration of the craft.
Spent all the winter time spinning, the most of it. Except for in spring you'd come, you'd have to do a bit of spring in. See, you couldn't be out then. Turf would be coming on you and everything. You'd have to be outside working. You'd shear the sheep first. You'd get the fleece and you'd wash it with lukewarm water, no soap. And when it's dry, you tease it, tease the wool. You grease it then, and you put it in the card then and card it, and make rolls with it and spin it in. We were spinning for blankets, big heavy blankets, and we'd send them away to the weaver then. And the weaver would waft them for us, and we'd take them home and wash them. We were spinning for flanning, but you wouldn't need to do it every year for flanning. You'd only do it maybe every 2 or 3 years. Women used to make big petticoats in them and dye them red. They always made blankets for themselves and socks and jumpers. At night is the best time to spin, when the sheep are quiet. You see, they're quiet at night, the sheep. They're lying down, they're sleeping, and that's the best time to spin, when the sheep are quiet. Oh, some of them used to spin in the daytime, you know. Spin in the daytime.
Annie's knowledge of the craft is well recognised locally. Nowadays, she helps teach younger women who are part of a community initiative in the area.
If we want to look at traditional knitting in Ireland, we have to look at the making of socks and stockings. So they would make up a bundle of socks or stockings, bring them into the nearest market or fair and sell them there for the few pence and have that money to put back into the household budget. They made them very commonly out of the undyed wool, the bawneen as some people would know it by, but also this sheep's grey, which is also undyed wool, a pair of stockings from County Galway. The type of stockings worn traditionally with pampooties, these are the untanned leather shoes worn until recent decades in the Aran Islands. They're probably worn in other parts of the country a lot longer. And we have here a pair of indigo or woad dyed stockings, this very dark blue, and with pattern on the top, but a very distinctive pattern, just peeping out over the front part of the pampootie. So these are the stockings worn with the pampooties by the men. But the women also had their own version of socks or stockings, and these are the lopini, or the miton, that again they would knit for themselves, again in undyed wool, a dark brown fleece. What these socks or stockings are footless or soleless stockings, with a flap at the back for the heel and a flap at the front to go over the front of the foot, and a little loop at the edge which loops over the toe nearest the big toe to keep them in position. And the women traditionally wore calf-length skirts, so these socks were protection against the cold and against the chill.
In many parts of the west of Ireland, traditional clothing was still being made and worn until relatively recently. The Aran Islands were particularly strong in retaining many elements of traditional dress, particularly the colourful kris or belt. Noni Flaherty still practices the making of the kris. She uses a technique of hand weaving which is known in other North European countries, from Iceland to the Baltics. The men wore the kris as a belt to secure their trousers. The older examples were made from undyed wool in colours of brown and off-white, but sometime early in this century the peacock factor came into play and the kris became the colourful garment it is today. Once a purely utilitarian garment, worn quietly and without show, now it is proudly displayed in all its glorious colours. When a woman got a length of cloth from the weaver, occasionally she might decide to work further on the cloth by napping it. This gives the cloth a pleasing surface finish which is also water resistant by curling the drawn out fibres. Napping is an ancient technique, and we are fortunate that Dr. Tony Lucas of the National Museum captured a demonstration of the process on film in the mid-1950s. The tools used are simple: 2 wool carders with steel teeth, a stiff bristle brush and a flat piece of cork. The flannel is laid on the pad and combed with the carders to draw out the length of the fibres. The material was then dabbed with randomly spread blobs of golden syrup. Once it would have been honey. The man at work here is Martin Lally, a man who comes from 3 generations of weavers in Carnmore near Ardenmore, County Galway. Martin was a weaver by trade and learned the napping techniques from his mother and grandmother. The last stage in the process is a kind of polishing. The piece of cork is moved over the sweetened fibres in short rotary movements. This produces a dense finish of curls. Red, as crimson or scarlet, was one of the most popular colours for women's clothes, especially for the making of the flannel petticoat or skirt, and was occasionally used in making the outer hooded cloak. Necessity, as always, was the mother of invention, and on the Aran Islands the spare flannel petticoat was often brought into service as a simple cloak. Sometimes the woven kris was used as a simple decoration. It was a case of making the most of what you had from a simple wardrobe. Young boys and girls were similarly dressed. The main item of clothing was a simple dress or frock known as a cóta cólac. The boys wouldn't get their first pair of trousers till they were about 12 years old. One reason put forward for this was that boys disguised as girls were less likely to be spirited away by the fairies. The women had to spin all the yarn to make the cloth. This yarn was then brought to the weaver. On Inishmore, the weaver was Saoirse Gillán, of a family originally from County Leitrim. On the islands, the clothing was pretty uniform. Above all else, these clothes needed to be warm.
On the Aran Islands, men would have worn what we can describe as a suit of clothes. The outer garment was the vest, and a léna gloss or a léna gurram were worn underneath it. This is the front part of the waistcoat is made from undyed fleece, while the back is the frieze dyed from either indigo or woad, giving a very dark blue colour. On the front of the waistcoat, the colour in the front of the waistcoat matches the colour of the trousers. And the kris, the woven, very colourful belt, made again by the women to hold up the trousers.
Siobhán Joyce, like other women on the islands, makes an income from knitting at home. What was an indigenous local industry now supplies handcrafted garments to the world at large.
Aran knitwear is no older than probably the beginning of the 20th century. But by the 1930s, again, it gave the women the opportunity to have their own independent money coming into the house. And as traditional knitters, they didn't necessarily repeat the same pattern from the front to the back. In some cases, they did. This is an older example made with the finer wool. And then an example encouraged by the country women's, the country shop and Dr. Muriel Gain. And we can see the pattern here in the front, and it's quite different to the pattern on the back of the jumper. Children's clothes then tended traditionally to be just a smaller version of what the adults were wearing. And we have here a very nice little jumper worn by a child. The women were making the clothes for themselves and their family, but the men made the shoes. And on the Aran Islands, the untanned leather shoes were known as pampooties, known by the people on the Aran Islands as broga or lahar. This is a pair which came into the museum in 1908, We know from literary reference that they were originally made of sealskin. This is possibly a pair of sealskin. The material hasn't been examined yet. And the man would have made them, of course, not just for himself and his wife, but for his children as well. Latterly not made from sealskin, but from cowhide. An unusual costume here made of straw. This was made in the early 1950s near French Park in County Roscommon. And it's a straw costume, part of a disguise worn by the straw boys or the uninvited guests at weddings. Still a custom in some parts of the country, even today.
He told me years ago down this year. I was just wondering.
Here in Fermanagh, at the home of Patrick Murphy, these men and women are making straw costumes for the group of mummers who will be performing tonight at the Ochakilly Maud Community Centre.
Here comes I, Captain Mummer, and all me merry men. Room, room, gallant people, give us room to ride. And we'll show you some activity, for this is Christmas time. We'll act the young, we'll act the old. We'll act what was never acted on any stage before. And if you don't believe in what I say, come in Beelzebub, and he will play the way. Here comes I, Beelzebub, and under my arm I carry a club, and in my hand a frying pan. I'm afraid to join me, man.
This grand set of mummer dolls have been made by a local craftswoman, Meg Jones of Munnaskee Townland outside Enniskillen, and they're based on her research of what the Bow mummers of West Fermanagh used to wear. Again, all the core characters and all the side characters of the mummers play in the Bow tradition here are represented here. You have Cromwell with my long copper nose, and you have Hector Bold. You have Miss Biddy Funny with my long leather bag to carry my money. Sir Green Knight, particular reference to medieval times, Arthur and the Round Table.
Here comes I, Prince George. From England I am lately sprung. Some of my noble deeds and venoms I am going to relate. For 7 years in a closed cave kept, I slew the fiery dragon through and through, and many the noble hero I did subdue for Ireland's rights and France's wrong. Show me the man before me stand, and I will cut him down.
One of the crucial characters, Prince George or Saint George, is here to do battle with the Turkish knight in a burlesque combat that's come down to us from the Crusades.
I fought Lord Dukes and Earls, and made the Spaniards quake. I'm the Turkey champion, all the way from Turkey land.
I will thrust my rusty weapon through your heart and make you die away.
The combat ends with one character dead, but it's hardly a glorious death, as the Turkish knight is having nothing to do with being dead.
What can you cure, Doctor?
Ah, sir, I can cure many things. Right. I can cure things like the big plague, the wee plague, the plague within, the plague without, the pip, the poll, the palsy, and the...
His restoration is the job of the doctor in his long black coat, and is a grand opportunity for mummery and flummery and long recitations of medieval hocus pocus. Whatever the doctor has in his bag, it's invariably powerful stuff, and the knight is soon back on his feet again.
Rise up, dead man, and fight again!
It has never died out in Fermanagh, and I think it's because Fermanagh is, by far and large, a rural county where a population of 55,000 knows each other and knows who's doing what in the county. It's a strongly rooted tradition. It has survived the television, it has survived the clerical condemnation, it has survived the early troubles of the 70s. And nowadays it forms also a part of the school curriculum for a lot of pupils. So with the schools now taking it on board, and with people actually fed up with TV and actually wanting to go out on the road and make friends with their neighbours and do something for their neighbours and join in some form of community activity, Mummins on a pure revival, and I could never see it dying out because basically it's too much fun for it to die out. Many rural communities did their bit by putting up a mummers play. It was a form of entertainment to break the midwinter. At the end of the day, the mumming tradition is one about the skies, and fooling your neighbours and trying to get the neighbours to guess who the person is behind the mask.
The same winter dark holds all of Ireland in its grip, and everywhere the response is the same. In a myriad of local communities, the old stories are brought out, the masks of mischief are put on, the old plays are updated with sly topical references. The straw and cloth and skills of the workaday world are transformed, and familiar faces take on an unfamiliar edge and glow. Whether with mummers, as here in this merry rowdy gang from Swords, or the more anarchic Wren boys marching through the country lanes of Athay, County Limerick, the mask tradition is all about change and transformation. Here in the dark end of the year, these people are making a magical act of faith that the dark days will pass and growth come round again.
Draw blood and sneak back innocent, to wait the next attack.
Beech tree tall and smooth-skinned, delicious to the breeze. High twigs, plate and ferner, the queen of trees. The alder is my...
The Armagh rhymers weave together the old and the new. They research and work with elements of song and story, costume and rhyme from north and south. They challenge and at the same time carry on the tradition.
What I fear most in the living word is the swishing to...
These young lads were once initiates to the tradition. By now they themselves are ancestors in that tradition, the passers on of rhyme and story.
Mr. Brennan, the worthy man, the two of us as we brought the run. Run, as you can see, is lined upon the holly tree. But your rep is by his side, and the Armagh boys to be his guide. Though he is small, his family is great, raise up good lady and give us a treat.
The Armagh rhymers are innovators in many ways. They work with elements of the mumming and Wren boys traditions. They go to wicker workers for their masks.
King of all birds, and Christmas Day was cutting a bird. Hunted them up, we hunted them down, in the woods we knocked them down. Hurrah, me boys, hurrah. On Christmas Day I turned the spit, I burned my finger, I feel it yet. Between my finger and my thumb, I came my blood as big as a plum. I brought box on to me gun, if you pass four will do no harm. If you fill it up the best, I hope in heaven your soul will rest. If you fill it up the small, I won't agree with the rampant at all. Up in the kettle, down in the pan, give your answer and let's be gone. Hurrah, me boys, hurrah.
They went to James Mulholland of the Loughney basket makers to get these masks of their own design. Wicker, not straw, new shapes, new masks. It was a challenge for James to use his traditional inherited skills, but let his imagination and ingenuity take flight.
He paused in the threshold,
flashed his sword of wood,
swung a lantern to and fro.
Three blood-red circles where he stood,
heard at listeners skip,
like goslings,
as if they understood. Bold as brass, a mother night come roaring through the door. Buzz the ladies on the right, smash the devil to the floor. Justice triumphs on the spot with straw like God's drawn everywhere. False Satan struts no more. Seen in worm-like darkness, through whirring decades ago, from which I still recall their faces like listening animals. A storm lamp swinging to and fro, and from those creaking country rhymes that party lament of bad times.
Christmas Day I turned the spit, I burned my finger, I feel it yet. Between my finger and my thumb, I came my blood as big as a plum. Have the bell box on to be gum, if you pass four will do no harm. If you fill it up the best, I hope for heaven your soul will rest. If you fill it up the small, I won't agree with the rampant at all. Up with the kettle, down with the pan, give us your answer and let us be gone.
The pulse of ancient memories beats on, but what makes a living tradition is change and inheritance. We take what was once the stuff of the everyday, and we keep and remember and transform it as best we can. Ancient shapes flicker in memory. Snatches of song and rhyme haunt and provoke us. In the end, it comes down to what we value. It comes down to deciding what we pluck and work with from the living stream.
That was the final programme of the Hidden Treasure series. Next Thursday at 9:30 you can see a programme from the series called Treasure Hunters that looks at the recent gold rush of 1983 on the island of Mindanao, the Philippines.